After 3 weeks of NFL football, there are quite a few backfields that are still ambiguous or just confounding altogether. Well, I've added the Vikings and the Cowboys to the list of backfields that we're going to watch, and we're going to take a look at the past week's production from each of the running backs in these running back rooms, and then take a look by week at their snap share, rush share, and target share. First, we have the Steelers. This week, Najee Harris once again led the running back room with 18 carries. He only had 70 yards, averaging 3.9 a pop, with a long of 21 and no rushing touchdown. Then we have Cordero Patterson. He finished with 4 carries for 33 yards, averaging 8.3 per carry with a long of 14 and no rushing touchdown. He took over for Jaylen Warren, who was hurt mid-game with a knee injury. Jaylen Warren is considered week to week at this moment in time, and should he miss any extended period of time, I think that Najee Harris has a lot more upside in this backfield. Jaylen Warren finished the game with 3 carries for 5 yards, averaging 1.7 yards per carry, very poor, with a long of 3. Overall, besides Cordero Patterson, this was an incredibly inefficient rushing day for the Steelers. When it comes to receiving production, Najee Harris did lead the team, at least in running back receptions. He also had the most receiving yards out of the running backs, but it was 5 receptions on 5 targets for 16 yards and no touchdown. When it comes to Cordero Patterson, he also had 5 targets, but he only had 3 receptions for 15 yards, so still 5 a pop. That's better than Najee, but not incredible either. Then with Jaylen Warren, he didn't finish the game, so he only finished with 1 target. Unfortunately, he lost 4 yards on his only reception. When we look at the snap shares week by week, in week 1, Najee Harris led the backfield with a 56% snap share, Jaylen Warren had a 31%, and Cordero Patterson had a 13%. In week 2, Najee Harris went from 56 down to 45%, Jaylen Warren went from 31% up to 48%, and then Cordero Patterson went from 13% down to 6%. When we look at week 3, Najee Harris went from 45% of the snaps all the way up to 59%. Jaylen Warren went from 48% down to 34%, and Cordero Patterson went from 6% up to 34%. It's a little bit hard to know between Warren and Cordero Patterson where they would have finished if Jaylen Warren didn't have that injury. And so that makes it a little bit challenging to figure out what we can glean from this week specifically. If anything, I would say that we should treat Najee Harris more as a featured back than normal, even though he gets a good amount of work regardless, and treat Cordero Patterson as a less useful Jaylen Warren potentially, although to be fair to him, he was quite efficient this game. When you look at their rush shares by week, in week 1, Najee Harris had a 48.78%, Jaylen Warren only had a 4.87% rush share, and then Cordero Patterson only had a 9.76%. In week 2, Najee Harris went down just slightly from 48.78% down to 47.22%. Jaylen Warren went up from a 4.87% all the way to 25%. And Cordero Patterson saw his rush share go from 9.76% down to 5.56%. When we look at the splits from week 2 to week 3, Najee Harris went from 47.22% up to 58.06%. That's the highest it's been all season. Jaylen Warren went from 25% all the way down to 9.68%, and Cordero Patterson had the highest he's had the entire season with a 12.9%, which was up from 5.56% in week 2. When we look at their target shares, in week 1, Cordero Patterson didn't receive a target. Jaylen Warren and Najee Harris split it evenly with a 9% target share apiece. In week 2, Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren once again had an even target share with 11.11% apiece. When we go to week 3, Najee Harris and Cordero Patterson had an even amount of targets, but Jaylen Warren once again only had 1. And so Jaylen Warren only ended up with a 3.23% target share to Cordero Patterson and Najee Harris's 16.13% apiece. In terms of what we can conclude here, we should probably treat Najee Harris as, I'd imagine, a high-end RB2 while Jaylen Warren misses time. I'd imagine he gets more work overall than he would should Jaylen Warren and Cordero Patterson be in the game, seeing as he had a 59% snap share in week 3, which is the highest he's had the entire season. although you'd hope he's a little bit more efficient than he was in week 3 with those touches. With Cordero Patterson, he's probably a useful waiver wire pickup if you need somebody in a pinch, although I wouldn't think he's going to be quite as efficient generally as he was in this game in general. And so we'll definitely have to keep tabs on Jaylen Warren's injury. Per a request from one of my subscribers, I added the Vikings backfield to watch. When we look at week 3, Aaron Jones easily dominated the rushing share here. He had 19 carries for 102 yards with 5.4 a pop, no rushing touchdowns, but a long of 39. Ty Chandler was the only other running back to receive a carry, and he has been throughout the first 3 weeks as well. He only had 7 carries for 13 rushing yards. That's only 1.9 a pop. Very inefficient day for him, and he only had a long gain of 5. And so easily Aaron Jones led the backfield in the rushing department. When we look at the receiving share, it's the exact same thing. Ty Chandler didn't end up with a target at all. Aaron Jones, however, had 6 targets, finishing with 5 receptions, 46 yards, and 1 touchdown. And so it was a brilliant day for Aaron Jones. And if you were an Aaron Jones fantasy owner, you're pretty happy with this. And if you're a Ty Chandler owner, you probably weren't starting him anyways. But if you own both of them, you got to be pretty happy that Aaron Jones is getting the majority of the work, because obviously you don't want to have to choose between the two of them. And so when we go to these snap shares, I hadn't been watching these through 3 weeks, but I went back, looked at the stats, and charted it out. When you look at week 1, Aaron Jones led the backfield split with a 55% share. Ty Chandler only had a 35% share. When we look at week 2, Aaron Jones went from 55% up to 61%, and Ty Chandler stayed at 35%. When we look at week 3, Aaron Jones dipped from 61% to 60%, same difference. They were winning easily against Houston, so there was really no need for him to exhaust himself, even though they gave him a pretty good workload. When we look at Ty Chandler, for a 3rd straight week, he logged 35% of the snaps. When we look at the rush shares, in week 1, Aaron Jones had a 53.85% to Ty Chandler's 30.77. In week 2, Aaron Jones went down from 53.85% all the way to 37.50%, while Ty Chandler actually outcarried him with a 41.67% rush share. In week 3, things returned much more to normal. In fact, Aaron Jones set a season high with a 67.86% rush share to Ty Chandler's season low 25%. When we look at the target shares, in week 1, Ty Chandler actually out-targeted Aaron Jones with a 13.04% target share to Aaron Jones' 8.7%. When we look from week 1 to week 2, Aaron Jones went from 8.70% all the way up to a 25% target share. That is crazy. And then Ty Chandler went from 13.04% to nothing in week 2. When we look from week 2 to week 3, Aaron Jones only dipped down 1%, going from 25% to 24%, and Ty Chandler for a 2nd straight week finished with no targets. And so what can we conclude here? Well, we can conclude that in general, it's going to be Aaron Jones' backfield, and at least the past 2 weeks, he has had a massive target share, while Ty Chandler hasn't had any percent of the target share. And that makes Aaron Jones a very high upside running back with a really safe floor as well due to his target share. When we take a look at the Bengals backfield, Chase Brown easily led the team in terms of efficiency, at least. He only had 7 carries, but he turned that into 62 rushing yards with a long of 16. Meanwhile, Zach Moss, while he wasn't horribly inefficient, wasn't nearly as efficient either, having 12 carries for 58 yards with 4.8 a pop to Chase Brown's 8.9. He did get the rushing touchdown, and his long gain was only 15 as opposed to Chase Brown's 16. When we look at the receiving work here, Zach Moss led the running back room, finishing with 6 targets, including 5 receptions for 39 yards and no touchdown. Chase Brown did have 3 targets, but he only turned that into 2 receptions for 7 yards, and so Zach Moss was more efficient on a per-target basis and did have more volume as well. When we take a look at their snap shares, Zach Moss in week 1 had a 65% snap share to Chase Brown's 33%. In week 2, that went all the way up to 80% to Chase Brown's 20%. When we look at week 3, Zach Moss's snap share did go down, but it only went from 80% down to 76%, so still really, really high. I mean, about 3/4 of the snaps. And Chase Brown's did go up from 20% to 24%, so a little less than 1/4 of the snaps. When we look at the rush shares here, In week 1, Zach Moss had a 56.25% to Chase Brown's 18.75%. In week 2, that did go down a little bit for Zach Moss, going from 56.25 down to 54.55%. Chase Brown's, meanwhile, remained almost exactly the same, going from 18.75% to 18.18%. In week 3, both of them saw their rush shares go up. Zach Moss ended up with a 60% rush share to Chase Brown's 35%. When we take a look at their target shares by week, in week 1, Zach Moss had a 13.79% to Chase Brown's 10.34%. In week 2, basically neither one of them had anything. Zach Moss did have a 2.94%, but Chase Brown didn't register a target. In week 3, though, Zach Moss did go up from 2.94% up to 15.79%, and Chase Brown went from not registering a target in week 2 to having a 7.89% target share in week 3. What can we conclude here? Well, we can conclude that Chase Brown is not going to get the amount of rushing work that Zach Moss does on a weekly basis. He doesn't get the goal line work that Zach Moss does, and he's also utilized less in the receiving game, and so Zach Moss is definitely the preferred back. Taking a look at the Jacksonville Jaguars backfield, Etienne easily led this backfield in carries with 11 for 68, no touchdown, but he had a long of 22. Johnson and Bigsby tied with 2 carries apiece. Johnson, however, finished with 12 rushing yards with a long of 11, and Bigsby finished with 9 with a long of 7. When we look at the receiving work here, Etienne easily led the backfield, finishing with 6 targets, including 4 receptions for 17 yards. He didn't score a touchdown, so relatively inefficient, but still, you'll take the receiving work. As far as Tank Bigsby, he didn't receive any receiving work. D'Ernest Johnson did finish with a target, but he didn't haul it in, so he finished with nothing. Taking a look at the snap shares, in week 1, Tank Bigsby had a 32%, and Etienne had 70%. In week 2, Tank Bigsby was hurt during a kickoff, so he didn't have a snap share. Etienne, however, finished with a 72%, and D'Ernest Johnson came in and had a 28% snap share. In week 3, Tank Bigsby came back. He only had a 13% snap share. Travis Etienne went down to 69%, and D'Ernest Johnson had a 17% snap share. When we take a look at their rushing shares week by week, in week 1, Bigsby and Etienne split it evenly with a 46.15% to D'Ernest Johnson's 0%. In week 2, Bigsby didn't receive any, Etienne had a 72%, and D'Ernest Johnson had a 28%. In week 3, Tank Bigsby had an 11.76% rush share to Travis Etienne's 64.71%, and D'Ernest Johnson's 11.76%. When we take a look at their target shares, in week 1, Etienne had 10.53%, and no other running back was targeted. In week 2, Travis Etienne had a 14.81% target share, and no other running back registered a target. In week 3, Tank Bigsby didn't receive a target again, but D'Ernest Johnson had 1, which he didn't haul in, so he did have a 2.27% target share, but Travis Etienne had a 13.64%. And what can we conclude here? Travis Etienne is easily the lead back, no matter whether Tank Bigsby's in or not, as well as D'Ernest Johnson. He's easily the preferred back. He gets to the goal line work, and while he didn't get a touchdown this game, he is going to be the preferred goal line back in this offense, and he's really the main receiving back as well, and so that means he carries most, if not all, of the upside. What do we have to worry about if we're an Etienne owner? The only thing we need to worry about is Tank Bigsby working his way back up to a nearly even rush share or potentially overtaking him. And now, while this game, Etienne was very efficient, it was really aided at the end of the game by a couple long runs at the end. He wasn't very efficient for most of the game, but that's really all we have to worry about. D'Ernest Johnson isn't going to do anything to Etienne or Bigsby, really. For now, Etienne owners can be at ease because Etienne is the preferred back. If you like what you've seen and heard so far, please feel free to like and subscribe. It's a free and easy way to support the channel. I go through all of these backfields week by week, keep track of their snap share, rush share, and target share, break them down for us, put it in a chart, and then delve through on a week by week basis the trends that we're seeing with all of these backfields. I'd like to continue doing this on a week by week basis so that we can have a good idea as to who is in general going to be the running back to own, and so we can keep tabs on running backs that might be a little bit under the radar. Once again, please feel free to like and subscribe. Thank you. Moving on to the Dolphins backfield, this was our first full week without Tua, and that really hurt A-Chain's efficiency. He went from being one of the most efficient running backs to posting 11 for 30 on the ground with a long of 13. Jalen Wright, a week after recording 5 rushes, but really being relatively inefficient, although he did have one called back that was about 10 yards or so. Well, he had 2 for 17. He looked really fast on his gain of 9. I really like what I'm seeing from him. Man, he is an absolute stash, especially if you're in a dynasty. If you are in a dynasty, grab this guy if you can get him for relatively cheap. I'm telling you, next year he is the Mostert replacement. Jeff Wilson, he also was pretty efficient. He had 3 carries for 14 yards. That's 4.7 a pop with a long of 10. When we look at the receiving work, A-Chain was the only running back used in the receiving game. He finished with 5 targets with 3 receptions for 26 yards and no touchdown. When we take a look at their week 1 snap percentages, in week 1, Jeff Wilson had 15% to Devon A-Chain's 52% and Raheem Mostert's 44%. In week 2, Raheem Mostert was hurt, so he didn't play. That led to Jeff Wilson having a 14% snap share to A-Chain's 62% and Jalen Wright's 24%. In week 3, we saw Jeff Wilson with a 23% to A-Chain's 74% and Jalen Wright's 21%. Taking a look at the rushing share in week 1, Jeff Wilson had a 20% to A-Chain's 40% and Raheem Mostert's 24%. In week 2, Jeff Wilson didn't register a carry, A-Chain had a 64.71%, and Jalen Wright had a 14.71% rush share. In week 3, Jeff Wilson had a 16.67% rush share to A-Chain's 61%, and Jalen Wright's 11.11%. When we take a look at their target shares, in week 1, A-Chain had a 19.44% to Raheem Mostert's 8.33%. In week 2, Jeff Wilson had a 5.41% to A-Chain's 18.92%. And then in week 3, A-Chain was the only running back to receive a target, and he finished with a 16.13% target share. All right, what can we conclude here? Well, Devon A-Chain is the featured back. It appears as though he's going to be the back to own regardless as to whether Raheem Mostert is in the lineup or not. But with Raheem Mostert potentially coming back soon, we may see his rush share dip down just a little bit, but his target share remains safe, and so he's still going to be the preferred back. With Raheem Mostert, when he plays, he's probably going to be an alright flex play for us. Jalen Wright's going to be relegated to the bench, and Jeff Wilson's just generally going to be unstartable as well. When it comes to the Raiders' backfield, Zamir White led the backfield in carries. However, he finished with 10 carries for 34 yards, averaging only 3.4 a pop with a long of 9. Alexander Mattison was the only other running back to have a carry. He only finished with 7 yards on 3 carries, but he did get a rushing touchdown. Once again, Zamir White not getting the goal line work. His upside is just so capped in this offense, and his floor is really nothing. When it comes to the receiving work, Amir Abdullah had 2 receptions on 2 targets for 13 yards. Madison had 3 targets, including 3 receptions and 37 yards. No touchdown for either one of them, and Zamir White wasn't targeted in the passing game. When we take a look at their snap percentages, in week 1, Zamir White had a 38% snap share to Madison's 60%, and Amir Abdullah didn't register a snap at all. In week 2, Zamir White went up to 63% from 38%. Alexander Mattison went down to 22% from 60%, and Amir Abdullah saw the field for the first time, finishing with a 13% snap share. In week 3, however, Zamir White went from 63% of a snap share in week 2 all the way down to 22% in week 3. Madison went from 22% in week 2 to 44% in week 3, and Abdullah went from 13% in week 2 to 34% in week 3. As far as the rush share is concerned, in week 1, Zamir White had a 59%, Alexander Mattison finished with 22.72%, and Amir Abdullah didn't register a rush. In week 2, Zamir White went down from 59% to 52.94%, Madison went from 22.72% up to 23.53%, and after failing to register a carry in week 1, Amir Abdullah had 11.76% of the carries. In week 3, Zamir White actually set a season-high mark in rush share. He had 62.5% of the rush attempts to Alexander Madison's 18.75%, with Amir Abdullah failing to register a carry in Week 3. Taking a look at the target shares, in Week 1, Zamir White had 6.25% to Madison's 18.75%, while Amir Abdullah didn't have a target. In Week 2, Zamir White went from 6.25% all the way up to 11.11%, while Madison went from 18.75% down to nothing, and Amir Abdullah had 5.56% of the targets. Then in Week 3, after leading the backfield with 11.11% of the targets, Zamir White failed to register a target in Week 3. Madison went from having no targets in Week 2 all the way up to 7.69% of the targets, and Amir Abdullah went from 5.56% to 5.13%, so relatively the same. And so it appears as though once again Zamir White has a very, very low floor and a low ceiling. Madison is the goal line back so far. He's had 2 rushing touchdowns and 1 receiving touchdown, and it potentially seems as though Amir Abdullah might be carving himself out a role. It may just be game script dependent. And so at this point, I would just completely avoid all of these running backs. Madison probably has the most potential upside, but it looks really hard to ascertain who's going to give you fantasy points, if any of them are, on a week-to-week basis. And so, yeah, just avoid this backfield until something distinctly changes. Moving on to the Bucs backfield, Bucky Irving looked a ton better than Rachaad White in the rushing game. He finished with 9 carries for 70 rushing yards, averaging 7.8 a pop with a long of 32. Rachaad White was incredibly inefficient for a 3rd straight week rushing the ball. It's par for the course with him. Great receiving back, horrible running back. Through the air, though, Rachaad White was the preferred back. He finished with 6 targets, hauling in 5 of those for 18 receiving yards. It was actually pretty inefficient, but he is a good receiving back. Bucky Irving finished with 3 targets, hauling in all 3 of them for 14 yards. He was more efficient, but not that great either. I did forget to mention that Sean Tucker also had 1 carry for 4 yards, but that was 0.4 fantasy points, and so he was basically a non-factor. When we take a look at their snap percentages by week, in Week 1, Sean Tucker had 3%, Rachaad White had 70%, and Bucky Irving had 31%. In Week 2, Sean Tucker didn't register a snap. Rachaad White went from 70 to 71%, and Bucky Irving went from 31% to 35%. In Week 3, Sean Tucker had 2%, Rachaad White had 74%, and Bucky Irving had 32%. Taking a look at the rush shares, in Week 1, Sean Tucker didn't register a rush. Rachaad White had a 50% rush share to Bucky Irving's 30%. In Week 2, Bucky Irving went from 30% to 30.43%, so relatively the same. Rachaad White had a 50% in Week 1, which went down to 43.48%. In Week 3, Bucky Irving had a 56.25% share of the rushes. Rachaad White only had 37.5%, and then Sean Tucker had 1 carry, so he had 6.25%. One thing to note here, in Week 1, Rachaad White almost doubled Bucky Irving in carries. Then it was a little bit closer in Week 2, and now Bucky Irving has overtaken him. When it comes to the target shares, in Week 1, Bucky Irving had 10% to White's 20%. In Week 2, Rachaad White was the only running back to register a target with 5.26%. And in Week 3, Bucky Irving had 9.38% to Rachaad White's 18.75%. What can we conclude here? Well, Sean Tucker is a non-factor. It's really down to Bucky Irving and Rachaad White. Rachaad White is probably going to remain the goal line back, but Bucky Irving is eating into his rushing percentage. I mean, he overtook him this game. I think that'll definitely continue because Rachaad White is just about the worst, if not the worst rusher of the football in the NFL. He is, however, one of the better receiving backs, so I think his receiving work is definitely safe, but his upside is severely limited now. With Bucky Irving, if he can work his way up to, say, a 60% rush share and then keep about a 10% target share, there's a chance that he could potentially be a flex in deeper leagues. And if Rachaad White was to go down with injury, we've already seen that he had a groin injury, which didn't cause him to miss any time. But if he does, I think that Bucky Irving could have a ton of upside in this offense. On the other hand, if Bucky Irving were to go down, Rachaad White's probably going back to what we saw this past season. But they are making an active effort to give him less carries. We've seen his share go from 50% to 43% down to 37% each of the first 3 weeks. When we take a look at the Broncos backfield, week 3 brought even more surprises. Tyler Beatty this time led the backfield with 9 carries for 70 yards, averaging 7.8 a pop with a long of 43. It was nice at least to see one running back be more efficient than Bo Nix. Javonte Williams was second, having 5 carries for 12 yards, averaging only 2.4 with a long of 5. And Jaleel McLaughlin also had 5 carries with only 7 yards, averaging 1.4. He did get a rushing touchdown though, and with a long of 7. When we look at the receiving work for the backs, Javonte Williams easily led the backfield. He had 4 targets, 4 receptions, 29 yards, averaging 7.3 per reception with a long of 11. The only other running back utilized in the passing game was Jaleel McLaughlin, who had 1 target, 1 reception, and 7 yards. When we take a look at the snap shares, in week 1, Jaleel McLaughlin had 35%, Javonte Williams had 52%, and Estime had 4%. Tyler Beatty didn't record a snap. In week 2, Jaleel McLaughlin went from 35% down to 28%. Javonte Williams went from 52% up to 66%. Estime was injured, so he went on IR. And Tyler Beatty had a 5% snap share. In week 3, Jaleel McLaughlin went from 28% down to 26%. Javonte went from 66% down to 51%. Estime is still on IR. And Beatty went from 5% up to 19%. When we take a look at their rush shares, in week 1, Jaleel McLaughlin led the backfield with 40%, Javonte had 32%, and Estime had 8%. When we look at week 2, McLaughlin went from 40% down to 18.75%. Javonte went from 32% up to 68.75%. Estime didn't record a rush, and Tyler Beatty went from 0% up to 6.25%. When we take a look at week 3, Jaleel McLaughlin went from 18.75% down to 17.86%. Javonte went from 68.75% down to 17.86%. Audric Estime was still hurt, and Beatty went from 6.25% up to 32.14%. Looking at their target shares, in week 1, Jaleel McLaughlin had 11.9% of the targets to Javonte Williams' 4.76%. In week 2, McLaughlin went from an 11.9% target share down to nothing. Javonte went from 4.76% up to 15.15%. And Tyler Beatty went from 0% up to 3.03%. Moving on to week 3, Jaleel McLaughlin went from 0% up to 2.94%. Javonte went from 15.15% down to 11.76%. And Tyler Beatty went from 3% down to 0%. This backfield is an absolute mess. I think it's going to be really challenging for us to ascertain who we want to start, if we want to start any of them. Tyler Beatty was by far the most efficient running back we've seen from them at all, although 43 of his yards came on 1 carry. I would avoid this backfield if you can. If you are desperate, pick your poison, but until we see a little bit more consistency, I don't think it's wise to start any of these running backs in Denver. The final backfield that we'll be reviewing is the Dallas Cowboys. This is also a new addition, just like the Vikings. In this game, Rico Dowdle led the running backs in carries with 8 for 32. It was only 4.0 per carry. Not terrible, but not that efficient either, with a long of 6. Ezekiel Elliott finished second with 3 carries for 6 yards with a long of 4. Deuce Vaughn was the third and final running back to receive a carry. He had 2 for 5 with a long of 4 as well. When we look at the receiving work for the Dallas running backs, Rico Dowdle led the backfield. On 5 targets, he had 3 receptions for 24 yards with a long of 18. Deuce Vaughn finished second with 2 targets, including 1 reception for 8 yards. And Zeke had 2 targets as well, finishing with 1 reception for 6 yards. Taking a look at the splits here, in week 1, Rico Dowdle had 44% of the snaps to Zeke Elliott's 51% and Deuce Vaughn's 3%. In week 2, Rico Dowdle went from 44% down to 43% of the snaps. Zeke went from 51% down to 40%, and Deuce Vaughn went from 3% up to 14%. In week 3, Rico Dowdle went from 43% up to 46%. Zeke went from 40% down to 19%, and Deuce Vaughn went from 14% down to 6%. Taking a look at the rush shares, in week 1, Rico Dowdle had 32% to Zeke Elliott's 40% and Deuce Vaughn's 4%. In week 2, Rico Dowdle went from 32% up to 33.33%, Zeke went from 40% down to 28.57%, and Vaughn went from 4% up to 19.05%. In week 3, Rico Dowdle went from 33.33% up to 50%, Zeke went from 28.57% down to 18.75%, and Deuce Vaughn went from 19.05% down to 12.5%. Looking at the target shares, in week 1, Rico Dowdle had 3.23%, Zeke had 6.45%, and Deuce Vaughn failed to register at target. In week 2, Rico Dowdle went from 3.23% up to 12.20%, Zeke went from 6.45% up to 7.32%, and Deuce Vaughn went from failing to register at target to having a 2.44% target share. In week 3, Rico Dowdle went from 12.2% of a target share down to 10%, Zeke went from 7.32% down to 4%, and Deuce Vaughn went from 2.44% up to 4%. Looking at this backfield through 3 weeks, Deuce Vaughn is the clear running back to avoid here. As to who I would prefer, if I had to start any of these guys, I would prefer Rico Dowdle. His rush share has gone from 32% up to 50%. It's gone up every single week. While in 2 of 3 weeks, he's easily led the backfield in targets. And so I think he offers you the safest floor with a pretty limited ceiling, but to be honest with you, none of these running backs would give you a very high ceiling. So I think, once again, if you have to start any of them, it's probably Rico Dowdle, and it's trending in his favor. If he can find a way to get a majority of the rushes, say 60%, while keeping a 10 to 12% target share, I think he could be a very safe flex play. He's not going to get you 0 points, but there are definitely running backs all over the board here on other teams that could give you much higher upside on a week-to-week basis if we're going to continue to see splits like these in the Dallas backfield. And that concludes our look at a couple of ambiguous or just generally interesting backfields. I'm especially curious what you think about the Buccaneers backfield. Do you think that Rachaad White gets overtaken by Bucky Irving? Let me know below in the comments section. With that being said, if you like what you've seen and heard in this video, please like and subscribe. It's a great way to let me know that you want me to continue charting out all of these backfields in terms of their snap share, rush share, and target share, and mapping out what we're seeing from week to week. Thank you, and have a good day.